What happened in that nursing home garden would make millions of people believe in miracles again. An 82-year-old woman with Alzheimer's was about to experience something that medical science couldn't explain. And it all started with a simple morning dance. Margaret Wilson stood in the garden of Golden Sunset Nursing Home as the morning sun painted everything gold. She wore her favorite pink dress, the one she'd owned for 30 years, though she couldn't remember buying it. Every morning at 7 o'clock sharp, she would come here and dance. The other residents had grown accustomed to seeing her graceful movements, her arms lifting like a young ballerina, turning and swaying to music only she could hear. But this particular morning in late September would change everything. Before we continue this incredible story of healing through music, if you believe in the power of human connection, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Margaret had been a dance teacher for 45 years. She'd taught thousands of students the art of movement, the joy of expressing emotions through dance, ballet, jazz, ballroom. She knew them all. Her studio in downtown Cleveland had been legendary. Parents would drive hours just to enroll their children in Miss Margaret's classes. She'd met her husband James at a dance competition in 1962. He'd been judging, she'd been competing. Their eyes met across the ballroom floor, and as she later told her students, she knew right then she'd marry him. They had 3 children together. Sarah, the eldest, became a doctor. Michael went into banking. Little Amy, well, Amy had inherited her mother's gift and now ran a dance studio in California. But Margaret didn't remember any of this anymore. The Alzheimer's had started stealing her memories 5 years ago, beginning with small things, where she'd left her keys, what she'd had for breakfast. Then bigger pieces began disappearing. Her children's faces became strangers. Her husband's death 3 years ago was a fresh wound every time someone reminded her. That's when Amy made the difficult decision to move her mother into Golden Sunset. The place had excellent reviews, specialized in memory care, and the staff seemed genuinely caring. But Amy's heart broke every time she visited, and her mother looked at her with polite confusion, asking if they'd met before. Meanwhile, in another wing of the nursing home, Robert Hayes was unpacking his last box. At 85, he'd resisted moving into assisted living until his arthritis made it impossible to manage alone. His fingers, once nimble enough to play Rachmaninoff's most challenging pieces, were now gnarled and stiff. Some mornings, he couldn't even button his own shirt. His children, David and Louise, had been gentle but firm. "Dad, you need help," they'd said. And reluctantly, he'd agreed. But what nobody knew was that Robert Hayes wasn't just any piano player. In the 1960s and 70s, he'd been Roland Hayes, one of the most sought-after jazz pianists in New York. He'd played with the greats. Duke Ellington had called him Hands of Gold. Miles Davis had recorded 3 albums with him. But when his wife Catherine got sick in 1978, he'd given it all up, moved to Ohio, and became a piano teacher. Then later, a music store owner. The fame, the late nights, the touring, none of it mattered compared to being with Catherine through her battle with cancer. She'd beaten it the first time. They'd had 20 more beautiful years together before it came back. This time she didn't win. That was 2 years ago. And Robert still reached for her side of the bed every morning, still set 2 cups for coffee, still heard her laugh in quiet moments. The grief had hollowed him out, left him a shell of who he'd been. His children worried he'd simply given up on living. That morning, when Robert saw Margaret dancing in the garden, something stirred in him that he hadn't felt since Catherine died. The woman moved with such grace, such memory in her muscles, even if her mind had forgotten. She was dancing to Moonlight Serenade, every beat, every pause perfectly timed to Glenn Miller's classic. How could she hear it when no music was playing? After Margaret stumbled and he'd spoken to her, Robert couldn't stop thinking about her. That night at dinner in the common room, he asked Jennifer, the head nurse, about the dancing lady in pink. Jennifer's face softened. That's Margaret. She's been here 2 years. Early stage Alzheimer's, though it's progressing. She was a dance teacher, very successful from what her daughter tells us. Every morning, she dances in the garden, says she's preparing for a recital. Does music help her? Robert asked, his musician's instincts stirring. Jennifer sighed. We've tried playing music for her, but she gets agitated, says it's not right, that it's interfering with her practice. So we just let her dance to whatever she hears in her mind. That night, Robert lay awake thinking. At 3 in the morning, an idea struck him. He needed to talk to Patricia, the nursing home director. But the real shock was still coming, something none of them could have predicted. The next morning, Robert was in the garden at 6:45, earlier than Margaret. Patricia had been surprisingly supportive of his idea. The maintenance staff had helped him move the old upright piano from the recreation room out to the covered patio overlooking the garden. It was out of tune and had definitely seen better days. But when Robert ran his stiff fingers over the keys, it responded, not perfectly, but enough. Margaret appeared at exactly 7 o'clock. Same pink dress, same distant expression. She took her position in the center of the garden and began to move. Robert watched for a moment, identifying the piece she was dancing to, The Way You Look Tonight. His hands, seemingly of their own accord, found the keys and began to play. The transformation was immediate. Margaret froze mid-turn, her eyes widening. For a moment, Robert thought he'd made a terrible mistake, that she would flee or become upset. But then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and continued dancing, now perfectly in sync with his playing. Other residents began gathering at windows. Jennifer stopped mid-medication round to watch. Even the usually busy kitchen staff peered out to see what was happening. Margaret danced through the entire song, and when Robert finished, she curtsied deeply, as if to an audience of thousands. Then she walked over to the piano, her movements more confident than anyone had seen in months. You play beautifully, she said. Have we worked together before? I feel like I know you're playing. Robert's throat tightened. Perhaps we have. In another life. Would you like to dance another? Oh, yes, Margaret said, clapping her hands like a young girl. Do you know Fly Me to the Moon? It's my husband's favorite. He'll be here soon to watch. Robert began to play, his arthritis temporarily forgotten. Margaret returned to her spot and began a slow, sensual rumba. As she moved, she began to speak, telling stories Robert suspected no one had heard in years. She talked about her first dance recital at age 6, how she'd forgotten the steps and improvised, making the audience laugh. She described meeting her husband James, how he'd been such a terrible dancer she'd offered him free lessons, just to spend time with him. What she found in her memories during that dance changed everything. The family secret that had been buried came flowing out as she moved. James never told me about his first wife, she said, still dancing. Found out at our 10th anniversary party when she showed up. Can you imagine? But we worked through it. Love does that, you know. Makes you forgive the unforgivable. Day after day, Robert played, and Margaret danced. Word spread through the nursing home, then to families, then beyond. Amy flew in from California when Jennifer called to tell her about the remarkable change in her mother. When she arrived, she found her mother not only dancing, but teaching. 3 other residents had joined her morning sessions, following her movements as Robert played. Mom? Amy said tentatively one morning. Margaret turned, and for the first time in 2 years, recognition flickered. Amy, is that you, sweetheart? You look tired. Are you eating enough? Amy burst into tears, running to embrace her mother. The moment was brief. Margaret's clarity faded within minutes. But it had happened. The doctors couldn't explain it. Music therapy was known to help Alzheimer's patients, but this level of improvement was unprecedented. What the nursing home staff realized was that Robert wasn't just playing music, he was playing Margaret's life. Somehow, through watching her dance, he could tell what era she was remembering and would adjust his playing accordingly. Big band for her childhood, bebop for her teenage years, contemporary jazz for her teaching days. He became her memory keeper, holding the timeline she could no longer grasp. 3 weeks into their morning sessions, something extraordinary happened. Margaret was dancing to Autumn Leaves when she suddenly stopped. She walked to the piano and placed her hand on Robert's shoulder. "Roland," she said, using a name no one had called him in 40 years. "Roland Hayes, is that really you?" Robert's hands froze on the keys. "How do you know that name?" Margaret laughed. A clear, beautiful sound. "I saw you play at the Blue Note in 1968, June 15th. You wore a burgundy suit and played round midnight so beautifully that everyone stopped talking. I was there with my sister Rose for her bachelorette party. You signed my napkin." Robert stared at her in amazement. This woman, whose mind couldn't remember her own children some days, remembered a single night from 57 years ago. "You wore a green dress," he said slowly, the memory surfacing. "You requested summertime, and you played it," Margaret said, her eyes bright with tears. "Just for me, you said." That's when the nursing home staff and gathering families witnessed something none of them would forget. Margaret began to hum "Summertime," her voice cracked with age, but still holding the melody. Robert's fingers found the keys, playing the introduction he'd played that night so long ago. And Margaret began to dance, not the careful movements of an elderly woman, but the fluid, confident steps of someone transported back in time. The dancing continued every morning, rain or shine. Patricia had a permanent cover built over the piano to protect it from weather. Families began timing their visits to coincide with the 7 o'clock sessions. A local news station picked up the story, filming Margaret and Robert during one of their morning collaborations. The segment went viral within hours. But the real magic wasn't in the viral videos or the news coverage. It was in the small moments. Margaret teaching a withdrawn veteran named Frank to waltz, bringing him out of his shell for the first time since his wife died. Robert's arthritis improving from the daily playing, his fingers gradually becoming more flexible. The way other residents began joining in, creating an impromptu dance class that filled the garden with laughter and movement. Dr. Sarah Coleman, a neurologist studying Alzheimer's, came to observe after seeing the viral video. What she documented was groundbreaking. During the dancing sessions, Margaret's cognitive function improved by measurable degrees. Her speech became more coherent, her memories more accessible. The effect lasted hours after the music stopped. Sometimes into the next day, Dr. Coleman began a formal study, but even she admitted that science couldn't fully explain what was happening. Then came Thanksgiving. Amy had arranged for all three siblings to visit, hoping their mother might recognize them during one of her clear moments. They arrived to find the nursing home transformed. The recreation room had been decorated for a special Thanksgiving recital. Margaret and Robert had been practicing for weeks, along with 12 other residents who'd joined their morning sessions. The room was packed. Families, staff, even some local dignitary had come after seeing the news coverage. Robert, wearing a suit for the first time in years, sat at the good piano they'd rented for the occasion. His fingers, still stiff but functional, waited on the keys. Margaret stood at the center of the makeshift stage, wearing a deep purple dress Amy had brought from her mother's old closet. "Good evening," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong. "Welcome to our Thanksgiving recital. We're grateful you're here to share this with us. Dance, you see, is the language of the soul. When words fail, when memories fade, the body remembers. The music remembers. Robert began to play. What a wonderful world! And Margaret began to move. One by one, other residents joined her. Frank in his wheelchair, moving his upper body in time. Dorothy, 93 years old, shuffling but smiling. Even some of the families were pulled onto the floor. Amy danced with her mother, both of them crying and laughing simultaneously. During the final number, "The Way You Look Tonight," Margaret stopped mid-dance and walked to the microphone. "I want to thank my pianist, Roland Hayes. Some of you might not know that name, but 40 years ago, he was one of the greatest jazz musicians in America. He gave it all up for love. And now, when both of us thought our best days were behind us, we found music again. We found dance again. We found life again." The room erupted in applause. Robert, tears streaming down his face, stood and bowed. Then he walked to Margaret and offered her his arm. Together, they took a final bow as the audience gave them a standing ovation. That night, after all the families had gone home, Margaret and Robert sat in the garden under the stars. Margaret's mind had drifted again. She thought Robert was James and held his hand, talking about their children when they were young. Robert didn't correct her. He simply held her hand and listened, grateful for the unexpected gift of purpose that had come into his life. The story could have ended there, a beautiful tale of connection and music healing. But life had one more surprise. 3 months after the Thanksgiving recital, a package arrived for Margaret. Inside was an old napkin, preserved in plastic. On it, in fading ink, was written, "To the lady in the green dress, may you always dance. Roland Hayes, June 15th, 1968. Margaret's daughter Amy had tracked it down through her Aunt Rose's estate. Rose had kept it all those years, tucked in a diary. When Amy showed it to her mother during one of her clear moments, Margaret smiled and said, "I told you he played just for me." The morning sessions continued. More residents joined. More families visited. Physical therapists incorporated dance into their treatments. The nursing home's atmosphere transformed from one of quiet resignation to one of possibility and joy. Margaret's Alzheimer's didn't go away. There were still bad days, confused moments, tears of frustration, but the music gave her anchors, moments of clarity that made the fog bearable. Robert's children were amazed at their father's transformation. The man who'd been ready to give up on life was now the nursing home's unofficial music director. He organized concerts, taught residents simple piano pieces, and even started composing again, something he hadn't done since Catherine died. One piece, Margaret's Dance, was performed by the local symphony, with all proceeds going to Alzheimer's research. The relationship between Margaret and Robert was hard to define. Sometimes she knew him as Roland the pianist, sometimes as a kind stranger, sometimes she mistook him for her late husband. But Robert understood. Love at their age, with their circumstances, didn't need labels. It was simply two souls finding comfort in shared moments of beauty. Dr. Coleman published her study, documenting what she called the Margaret effect, the surprising improvement in cognitive function when Alzheimer's patients engaged in activities tied to deep muscle memory and emotional connections. The study sparked new research into alternative therapies, with dance and music programs being implemented in nursing homes across the country. But for Margaret and Robert, none of that mattered as much as their morning dances. Every day at 7 o'clock, rain or shine, the piano would sound, and Margaret would dance. She danced through winter snow, visible through the glass walls of the covered patio. She danced through spring rain, pattering on the roof. She danced through summer heat and autumn colors. One morning, a year after their first dance, Margaret had one of her clearest days. She sat beside Robert at the piano and said, "You know, I won't always remember this. I won't always remember you. But somewhere in here," she placed her hand over her heart, "the music lives. And as long as the music lives, I'll keep dancing." Robert, his voice thick with emotion, replied, "Then I'll keep playing." And he did. Every morning, 7 o'clock sharp, the garden at Golden Sunset Nursing Home filled with music and movement. Staff members would pause to watch. New residents would be drawn to the windows. And in those moments, the nursing home wasn't a place where people came to fade away. It was a place where life, against all odds, continued to dance. The day Margaret passed, 2 years after that first garden dance, she'd been dancing just hours before. Robert had played Moonlight Serenade, the song that started it all. She'd moved with unusual energy that morning, as if she knew it would be her last dance. When she finished, she'd walked to the piano, kissed Robert on the forehead, and said clearly, "Thank you for the music, Roland. Tell James I'll see him soon." She died peacefully in her sleep that afternoon, Amy holding her hand. At her funeral, Robert played "The Way You Look Tonight," while a video montage showed Margaret dancing in the garden. There wasn't a dry eye in the chapel, but more than sadness, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the music that had given Margaret back to them, even if just in moments. Gratitude for the dance that had made her final years not just bearable, but beautiful. Robert continued playing every morning at 7. Other residents still came to dance. He said he could feel Margaret there, moving in the garden just beyond what his old eyes could see. He played for another year before his own health declined. His children found him one morning, slumped peacefully over the piano keys, having passed while playing Summertime. The nursing home created the Margaret and Robert Memorial Garden, where a small plaque reads, "Where words fail, music speaks. Where minds forget, bodies remember. Dance while you can." The piano still sits on the covered patio. A new music therapist plays every morning at 7, and residents still gather to dance. Sometimes, staff members say, on quiet mornings when the light hits just right, you can see two figures in the garden, an elderly woman in a pink dress and a man with golden hands, dancing and playing for all eternity. Their story inspired a foundation that provides music and dance therapy to nursing homes nationwide. Thousands of elderly residents have found joy, connection, and moments of clarity through the programs. Amy runs it now, having left her own dance studio to carry on her mother's unexpected legacy. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is what it teaches us about hope, that even in our darkest moments, when disease steals our memories and age steals our strength, there is still room for magic. There is still room for connection. There is still room for love. And sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to play the music while we remember how to dance. Well, folks, if this story touched your heart like it touched mine, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for miracles. Leave a comment below about a time when music or dance brought healing to your life. And remember, tomorrow is never promised, so dance while you can. Until next time, keep believing in the power of human connection. Peace out.